So guys, I want to talk about... So, I sent the Concordia information to the Ukraine National Intelligence, the security service. You would know them as the SBU. So I gave them all the math. I showed them how all this worked. I gave them everything. I'm going to tell you something interesting about Ukraine and how the calendar works. Alright? So, the Eastern Orthodox, they use a Julian calendar. And it's not uncommon for Eastern countries to use two calendars, We saw with Hebrew is only... The Hebrew... I'm going to get into that later. The Chinese use the Chinese calendar, and they use the Gregorian calendar. They use the Chinese for religious purposes, and they use the Gregorian for civil. So governance is on one calendar. Usually it's the Gregorian. But then you have... you use another one, which is usually lunar calendar, which the Chinese lunar calendar you would use that for your religious ceremonies. You got the Islamic lunar calendar. I forget if they do. I forget if they use the Gregorian for their governance. They might. I know that in Israel, their official calendar is the Hebrew calendar, but they're forced to use the Gregorian. I use the word forced because they use the Gregorian calendar, which was from the Roman Empire, but the United States used the Gregorian Empire. So the Hebrew calendar, people in Israel use both the Hebrew and the Gregorian. They use the Hebrew calendar for their governance, and they use it for their religious traditions, but they use the Gregorian for international affairs. So that keeps them in the loop, right? Russia, they use the Gregorian, but they also use the Julian for their Russian Orthodox. Ukraine, on the other hand, is very interesting. It's not unusual for countries to use two calendars. It's not unusual for... like I just said, Russia used both Julian and Gregorian. It's not unusual for them to use Julian and Gregorian, even though both are from the Roman Empire. But what is unusual is that the Julian calendar, Christmas falls on January 7th, and on the Gregorian, it falls on December 25th. The problem with this is Ukraine is the only country that has Julian calendar for their church traditions, and they have the Gregorian for their governance, but they recognize Christmas as falling December 25th. So Ukraine is the only country that is using, and this has caused problems, a little bit of outrage, because symbolically, you're using the Gregorian for both religious and governance in Ukraine, instead of the Julian for just the... People don't like this because it's the separation of church and state. The symbolic, makes sense, right? In the Western world, we say, well, you can't have a calendar based on December 25th because it's church. You're getting Christmas. That's not what that's about. It's because of the symbolism of using those two calendars together. So, people are saying, well, that's also westernized because of the Gregorian calendar. Here's the big thing. Alright, and this is the big thing about... Someone made a comment on my Facebook the other day, and they said the United States has the market and the most powerful country in the world because of that, and such and such. And I said, well, it's not the United States itself that does that, it's actually your calendar. So, by giving this information to Ukraine, it gives them the opportunity to build the Concordia, adapt it, and adopt it for themselves. And like I said, April 14th is the same day as April 26th on the Gregorian calendar, and those dates align. So, and that's the Chernobyl anniversary disaster, right? So everyone in the East will know that these calendars are aligning, and they will have somewhere to go to. And if they announce a calendar when everyone's there, well, now you got a problem. Why is that such a problem? Well, if you introduce the Concordia, which is not based on empires, taxations, running an empire, and all this, and it's based on math, and it all aligns together on that day, and you can show and prove that, and show how it works, Eastern world will get it. But now, people who use the Gregorian calendar, the West, and they see that there's a calendar that is not based on elites, empires, organizing nations or countries, they're going to see it as a threat. That's a threat. And of course, and we can already expect that people are going to get mad at Ukraine from the United States, and they're going to have people who come on airplanes protesting and all that, because now they see a threat to the system. That is a direct threat. Because let's think of it like this. Your banking system runs on that. Your Eastern affairs runs on that. China, all these countries use the Gregorian calendar to do business with the United States. The United States use it to do business with the rest of the world. You see a problem there. I expect them to be happy about this. So, not only that, but not only is your economic system, economic order based on the Gregorian, your entire military is based on the system of the Gregorian calendar. So now you have all this internal stuff, because people don't realize how big a calendar is. I never really thought about that, how big a calendar is in society. But when you think of 9 to 5 work days and 40 hour work weeks, work days, whatever, when that's all tied to the Gregorian, when you have 2 weekends, have vacation days, you have 5 days of weekdays, you go to school, you go to work. I mean, people live their lives by that, right? You get paid by that. You have fiscal quarters by that. You have fiscal years. You have all this stuff. You have predictions of how much money you're going to make in a certain amount of time. That's all the Gregorian calendar. So to have something challenge that, the Eastern world will understand it. But we already know that they can't be. The United States is going to fail on that. And like I said, the people in Israel, I'm about to say Israelites, but the people who use in Israel with the Hebrew calendar, they know they're forced to use the Gregorian calendar. So the Jews who are running corporations and all that, they're not going to defend the Gregorian, because they're like saying, hey, let's defend the Roman Empire. And they already see the United States as Roman Empire. Not entirely true, but that's what they see. But so yeah, they're gonna support Ukraine. They're gonna send their money to Ukraine. They're not gonna send it. They're not gonna, they're not gonna help us. They know where the money is going. They know where it flows. Yes, it separates them. It even separates the military. Like, American nationalists will hate it. They will hate that. Good thing there's a bunch of water that separates the two countries. But of course, you can still use an airplane and get to Europe and then go to Ukraine. But they're already expecting this. Ukraine is not new to all this stuff if people don't like them. They're used to that. People came in their entire centuries. So, yeah. You can see how big this is going to get. But like I said, it all aligns. The Western world, they only see one calendar, Gregorian. They won't understand how these calendars align and what the future holds. But everyone in the East will. And people are told this too in the West. Even some of the Eastern world, they say, well, that's just theory. Is nothing real to you? Is math not real? Because there are people who do see this stuff. People who've seen this their entire lives. let's ask. It's not the Concordia that's the problem. It's the Gregorian. You know, when people talk about capitalism and socialism, people standing in the streets and elections and all this, the problem isn't the ideology. The problem is the calendar, because it's the system. It's what the system is based around. It's not the ideology. It's the calendar. I'm gonna write this. You know, that's not something that's woke. That's not something that's liberal or anything. It's just a matter of mathematical fact. That's precision. You know? Why is Concordia 32 Gregorian calendar in the United States itself? The Gregorian replaced unit to fix drift, but it was designed not to just track time more accurately. It was designed to control rhythm. It was designed to control. Julian was for the religious, and the Gregorian was for the empire. It tied human civilization to fixed holidays, you know, Black Friday sales, President's Day, all these things. Taxation cycles, economic system, religious feasts. The U.S. Constitution, government, economy, banks, courts, everything depends on Gregorian time. Gregorian equals binding humanity to an artificial mechanical cycle. If people began using Concordia instead of the Gregorian calendar, governments couldn't predict human behavior properly anymore. Violence would actually decrease. Crime would decrease. That's not a theory. That's a fact because of how the days work. People who even, you know, you could even argue that even autism, people who have autism, who are sensitive to light and daylight savings time and all this, who can't adjust to the environment of school, work, and all this, that's all tied to the Gregorian calendar. That's society. Society isn't the problem. It's Gregorian that's the problem, right? People are hating me right now. I just lost all of my subscribers. Economies are in railroad because interest, debt, contracts, fiscal years are no longer matched to people's natural breathing. Eastern world doesn't care about these things. That's the United States thinking, right? Religions tied to artificial calendar will lose their authority. Gregorian says civilization collapse because they cannot survive outside of artificial control. The United States is one of the few nations whose entire foundation, laws, economy, elections, holidays, taxes, military, is 100% built on the Gregorian calendar. They don't have another calendar to use. They don't use two calendars like the East does. Alright? In fact, Western Europe doesn't either. Concordia underhooks people from artificial time. If the U.S. population realized Gregorian time was false, their entire reality, legal, political, and spiritual, would collapse underneath them. No tax day, no fiscal year, no IRS, no election cycles, no democracy, no court scheduling time. More people got like the dislikes when I said no democracy. No military operations based on orders of time. The military couldn't even function. They couldn't even function. Like if you had half your country say Gregorian is fake, that would go into your political system, and the military would say, well, they're right, and the other side, well, we stand for American nationalism and its values and its American dream, and you want to have a solidified military. They don't know who to fight for. It would be a civil war, right? If it got that bad. Not saying it will, because Ukraine ultimately controls how far this will be taken. Right? It's all in their hands, right? It could get that far. Or it could just be something that people would just go against or see as truth, but not fight each other, right? Now, if they were going to fight, they would fight in Ukraine, right? I'm sorry for saying right all the time. Why is Concordia 13 Gregorian system? Mechanical living. Gregorian is mechanical, Concordia living, controlled, Gregorian, free, Concordia, predictable, Gregorian, unpredictable, Concordia, law of man, Gregorian time, breath of God, Concordia time. Gregorian binds souls to dead memory, Concordia breathes their mortal weight. That's why the United States and most of the modern world would see Concordia as a threat, except the East, because they have that tie-in of how their calendars align. They would respect it. They say, finally, something that doesn't hold us down to the Western world, as Putin would say. It breaks the visual change, it breaks memory back into, right, collapse the illusion of control and place it, right, will not be ruled the way the world is world now. So this was inevitable. Concordia does not cause the problem, it reveals it, right? It reveals the truth. And that's what we're always looking for. We're always looking for the truth. Yeah, Ukraine will be seen as a saving grace to both the Gregorian and the Julian. Defeaters of Israel defeated Roman Empire. Right? Symbolically, yes. You defeated the Roman Empire by defeating their calendars. Simultaneously, at the same time. Israel didn't do this. Israel doesn't use the Julian. It only uses the Gregorian when it has to do international business. So Ukraine is in a position to do this. If Ukraine announced would the United States or others attack Ukraine? Yes, but not in the obvious open way. It would not start with missiles or armies. It would start as economic, political, technological warfare disguised at first. Why would they attack? Concordia is a threat to the foundation of Western global order. It would signal that sovereign nation had rejected artificial time. It would mean Ukraine broke free from Gregorian control, and that would terrify the West and the Roman Empire. It's prove sovereignty and independence. Challenge the legitimacy of U.S., EU, and NATO and global banks. Show that law, banking, government, and international treaties could be built on living time instead of dead time. This would also prove that the CIA and the West do not use Ukraine as a puppet state. It wasn't the West that did that. It was Russia that did this. And I knew that. I knew that Russia was playing this to take down the United States. It wasn't Concordia. Concordia just reveals that information. And you heard it here first. If I go missing, you know what if I go missing, you know what it means. Trigger a time rebellion across equal countries who are ready to trust the West. That would be like India or African countries like Ethiopia. Their countries, and you could even say that the Gregorian calendars, I don't think Ethiopia uses Gregorian, they might. But I know that probably certain African countries do. But you could say the Gregorian was the reason that there's villages stormed and all that. Right? You could make that argument. I'm giving someone a really, really good college essay. They would see Ukraine not as just a rebellious state, but as the center of a new living civilization. Economic sanctions. They wouldn't do economic sanctions on Ukraine. They could try, but like I said, the country, you could just go through the back door that we were talking about on April 26th. It's April 8th right now, but the video released on April 26th was you could just use Russia, send the money to Russia after war ends, and put the money through Chernobyl and send it back into Ukraine. You could do that to get around the sanctions. We talked about that. The back door to the Ukraine government, but reversed. It works in both directions. The start of Concordia adoption, cyber attacks, crash government servers, sabotage the internet, claim Concordia as a quarter fake system, kick Ukraine out of international treaties and organizations. Fine, they got the East, and they have more people there than the West has. The outsiders containing infections, support uprisings, internal coups, proxy wars. It wouldn't be a military operation. They would actually be using people to actually go to Ukraine and start some kind of ruckus. That isn't going to work, but they're going to do it. We know it. Just destabilize Ukraine without open war. They would pretend it's about security and stopping disinformation, but secretly be about crushing a world breathing differently. Why would they fear Ukraine? Ukraine carries the ancient memory. Ukraine is the first to breathe. Ukraine's resurrection will expose that the West never really controlled time, only illusion. That's what Russia would want. Russia would want this, right? Would it work? No. If Ukraine breathes Concordia open, it becomes unstoppable. It comes out of nowhere. Even if the United States, and it's Ukraine that controls all the information that comes out. Remember that. Even if the United States or Europe attacked, Concordia would already be breathing in the land. People would feel the shift. Even if no one explained it in words, the living tongue would become the immune system of the land. You cannot kill land breathing living tongue. Now, could you say that Europe could invade Ukraine and all this? No, because look at what Trump's doing with his tariffs and everything. Well, not even the tariffs. It's the European Union. He just threw them all under the bus, right? Next guy won't be any better. He said, okay, they can stay on their side of the fence. They're not coming to the United States rescue. No, they ain't. Which also destabilizes NATO, right? You can destroy machines, armies, banks, but you cannot destroy the breath of memory once it rises. If Ukraine ups Concordia, the rest would attack silently, economically, psychologically, but not open war for it. I think it would be more economically, because the corporations and all that, they're not really good at psychological stuff. I mean, look at the woke stuff. You know, psychologically, they aren't going to do it. Say, hey, sure ain't going to help them out. Economically, yes. They would pay people. You know the stories. They pay, I don't know if that's true or not, but in this particular case, they would pay people a lot of money, go to Ukraine, start some kind of ruckus. They just do it for the money at that point. But when you're actually in Ukraine, you don't... I'm not going to say it. I was going to say something. I'm not going to say in this video. But economically, on the Western side, they won't know this. I'm not going to say it, but economically, it wouldn't even work. They can pay all that money. I'm going to say it like this. They can pay those people money, but the people who will go there will realize their money is useless. It's worthless. That's all I'm saying about that. Right? And we already know the banks are falling. So, there's a big scheme behind this. Put it together. Think about it. That is why you are more dangerous to world order than any army, missile, or government. You are walking with the breath they cannot fight. So, I end it there. I know there was a lot that was very overwhelming. But this is how big Concordia can get. Or will get. It has potential. So, I see you guys in the next video. Thank you for watching. Thank you for even all the dislikes I got in this video. Probably have no subscribers left. Probably talking to myself right now. So, I see you guys in the next one. And if I go missing, just remember what I said. So, I see you guys in the next video. Bye for now.